Japan didn't need to bomb this front. They had already won, on paper. Between India and China, the Allies depended on a single railway, not a modern supply artery, not a war-ready system, but a narrow, colonial-era line built to move tea, not tanks. When Japan cut the Burma Road, every Allied plan in the region collapsed into one question. Could this railway carry the weight of a modern war? Japanese planners looked at the numbers. The gauge was too narrow. The tracks were too old. The monsoons erased miles of rail every year. Freight had to be ferried across one of the largest rivers on Earth, car by car. Their conclusion was simple. No army could be supplied through this system. Not sustainably, not at scale, not ever. They were right about everything, except one thing. They assumed the railway would stay the same. What followed was not a clever fix or a technical breakthrough. It was something far more dangerous. The moment an entire war began to hinge on whether an impossible supply line could be forced to work. If you enjoy deep, untold stories about how wars are really won, consider liking the video. It helps this story reach more people. Now, let's see why this railway should have failed. They called it a railway, but in truth it was a compromise, an old, narrow promise laid across a landscape that refused promises. If you stood anywhere along the Bengal and Assam line in late 1943, you wouldn't see the sort of supply artery a modern army expected. You wouldn't see broad, double-tracked main lines with neat sidings and synchronized signals. You wouldn't see the invisible confidence of industrial logistics, where a schedule is law, where delays are exceptions, where breakdowns are treated like crimes. You would see something older, a meter gauge track, 3 feet and a few inches wide, running through a country that could drown it for half the year. The steel was not built for war. It had been laid for commerce, tea, passengers, small freight, predictable seasons. The railway's original purpose was simple and local. Move goods from the northeast down toward Calcutta. Bring manufactured items back up. Keep the flow modest, steady, cheap. War demanded the opposite of everything this system had been designed to be. And that was the first truth. Before monsoons, before rivers, before locomotives, before enemy pressure, this railway was never meant to scale. Not to thousands of tons per day. Not to the kind of relentless, punishing rhythm required to feed airfields, road-building regiments, and armies preparing to retake Burma. In an American context, railway implied capacity. In India's northeast, it implied survival. The constraint began with the gauge. A meter gauge meant lighter track, smaller bridges, sharper curves. It made sense when budgets mattered more than throughput. It also meant smaller locomotives, smaller rolling stock, and reduced stability at speed. You could run trains, yes, but you couldn't run them like you ran the big arteries back home. Everywhere you looked, you saw the signature of economy rather than power. The freight cars weren't the long, high-capacity boxcars that could swallow war supplies like a hungry machine. Many were short, four-wheel cars designed for modest loads, typically 8 to 10 tons. To move the same volume you'd move with fewer cars on a standard gauge system, you needed more of them. More coupling, more braking, more wear, more time at every yard and station. More complexity on a system already drowning in complexity. And then there was the infrastructure beneath it all. Victorian bones trying to carry a 20th century war. Signals, where they existed, were often manual. Dispatching was not a modern, centralized command of traffic. It was a patchwork of human operators, telegraph lines, and local decisions. On a single-track line, local decisions could become systemic failures. If one section stalled, every section behind it paid the price. A modern railway doesn't just move trains, it moves certainty. This one moved trains when it could. Even before you reached the Northeast, the system forced you to respect its fractures. At Parbatipur, hundreds of miles from Calcutta, there was the brutal reality of a gauge break. Broad gauge met meter gauge, and nothing passed through cleanly. Cargo had to be transferred. Every crate, every drum, every box became a delay. Paperwork became delay. Labor became delay. Rain became delay. A delay in transfer wasn't merely an inconvenience, it was a multiplier, because every hour lost there meant a train missed elsewhere, a ferry slot lost later, a schedule collapsing all along the line. Then, as the line wandered onward, it did not run like a confident stroke across a map. It followed the path of least resistance. It threaded river valleys, floodplains, soft ground, terrain that was easier to build through cheaply, not terrain that promised reliability. Reliability was the currency of war. This railway was poor, and the monsoon made sure everyone remembered it. For months each year, the sky didn't simply rain, it attacked. In some places, rainfall reached levels that sounded like exaggeration until you saw the results. Embankments slumped, ballast washed out, track buckled, and whole sections of line could vanish overnight. Landslides were not rare disasters. They were expected interruptions. Flash floods weren't dramatic events, they were routine. The question wasn't whether the railway would be damaged, it was how quickly crews could keep it patched enough to function. War planners loved arithmetic. Monsoons loved erasing it. Yet none of these constraints, none of them, was the true bottleneck. The bottleneck was water. The Brahmaputra River was not a river in the way people from temperate countries imagined rivers. In flood stage, it became something else, wide, shifting, and indifferent to human plans. It could stretch more than a mile across, its channels changing with season and sediment, sandbars forming where the map insisted there was depth. It was a living obstacle, and in the early 1940s, there was no rail bridge across it. That meant the railway broke in the most humiliating way possible. It stopped and begged for a ferry. At the crossing, a freight train didn't glide through, it disintegrated. Cars were uncoupled, rolled onto barges, secured, pulled across by tugs, docked, rolled off, coupled again, reassembled into trains, one by one. You can't rush a process like that without breaking something. And if you break something, you lose more time than you gained. The ferry crossing became the throat of the entire system. And it had a physical limit. No discipline, no courage, no screaming orders could move more than a certain number of cars across per day. A modern war does not forgive physical limits. Even without enemy action, this crossing alone could throttle an entire theater. Now add war. Add airfields in Assam that needed fuel and bombs and spare parts. Not eventually, not when convenient, but constantly. Add new depots, new roads, new engineering projects. Add American-trained Chinese divisions preparing for offensives. Add British forces building toward major operations. Add the demand of a global conflict funneling into this narrow line like floodwater forced into a cracked pipe. The pipe did what cracked pipes do. It leaked time. It leaked capacity. It leaked momentum. The railway's peacetime volume had been modest, hundreds of tons per day, enough to serve the region's economy. War demanded multiples of that, day after day, in all seasons, under the threat of interruption. You could push the system beyond its design, and they did. Crews worked longer hours, maintenance intervals were sacrificed. Passenger services were cut, repurposed, stripped down. Locomotives pulled more than they were meant to pull. Cars ran longer than they should have run. Track was patched and shimmed and prayed over. But improvisation has a ceiling. Eventually, every shortcut becomes a breakdown. Locomotives sat waiting for parts. Freight cars sat waiting for locomotives. Cargo sat waiting for space on the line. And everywhere, the war waited with a cold, mechanical patience. This is where Japan's calculation begins to look less like arrogance and more like ruthless logic. From a distance, you could argue that armies are stopped by mountains. In reality, armies are stopped by the inability to feed themselves through mountains. In the China-Burma-India theater, geography didn't need to kill soldiers directly. It just needed to starve the supply chain. It needed to keep fuel off runways. It needed to keep steel out of road crews' hands. It needed to keep ammunition from reaching units that could only ration 3 rounds per rifle. You can't fight modern war on 3 rounds. You can't build a road with no fuel. You can't run an airlift without aviation gasoline. And if you can't do those things, the entire theater becomes a strategic dead end, existing on maps, consuming men, but producing no decisive pressure against Japan. That was the creeping terror behind the railway's failures. It didn't threaten one battle. It threatened the existence of strategy. Allied planners could imagine offensives, could draw arrows, could name objectives, could promise timelines. But every plan collapsed into one ugly, unglamorous question. How many tons can the railway actually deliver, day after day, when the monsoon arrives and the river demands its toll? If the answer stayed low, nothing else mattered. And the answer did stay low, stubbornly, humiliatingly low, far below what the theater required. The railway was not evil. It was not incompetent. It was simply what it had always been, a colonial-era system built for the economy of yesterday, forced to carry the survival of tomorrow. Japan saw that. They saw a line with breaks, bottlenecks, and seasonal destruction. They saw a system managed like a patchwork rather than a machine. They saw a physical choke point that no heroism could erase, and they concluded, this cannot be fixed fast enough to matter. In the strictest sense, they were correct. You cannot widen a gauge in wartime. You cannot conjure a bridge across a river that punishes bridges. You cannot change climate with planning. You cannot will Victorian infrastructure into an industrial artery. So if the war in this theater was going to live, it would have to live inside the constraints, inside the narrow gauge, inside the monsoon, inside the ferry crossing. It would have to live in a system that should have failed. And the most dangerous part was this. By late 1943, the railway wasn't simply underperforming. It was approaching the moment when failure would become contagious. When one derailment, one washout, 1 week of delayed parts would cascade into paralysis. When yards would clog, sidings would fill, trains would sit trapped behind trains, and the line would become not a supply route, but a museum of stalled freight. That was the edge of the cliff. Not a dramatic explosion, not a last stand. A slow, quiet strangulation of everything the Allies claimed they intended to do. In the next act, the story stops being about what the railway lacked and becomes about what happens when a war decides it will not accept those limits, even if geography insists they are absolute. By the end of 1943, the railway was no longer merely inadequate. It was becoming dangerous. Not dangerous in the cinematic sense, no explosions, no heroic last stands, but dangerous in the way systems fail quietly, then suddenly. The kind of danger that creeps in through schedules, inventories, and assumptions. The kind that turns planning into guesswork and confidence into hope. On paper, the Allied presence in the China-Burma-India theater looked substantial. There were airfields carved out of Assam's jungles, roads pushing northward through terrain no road had a right to cross, divisions training for offensives that would reopen the land route to China. There were names for these efforts, charts, deadlines. In reality, all of them were tethered to the same fragile thread, the railway. When the Burma Road was cut, the airlift over the Himalayas, flying the hump, became the only way supplies reached China. But airlift is not magic. It is arithmetic. Every aircraft needs fuel. Every engine needs spare parts. Every bomb dropped on the other side of the mountains must first arrive at an airfield that exists only because supplies reached it by rail. The irony was brutal. The airlift that was supposed to bypass geography became hostage to it. Assam's airfields multiplied quickly, but their appetite grew faster. Aviation gasoline became the single most critical commodity in the theater. Without it, aircraft sat on the ground. Without aircraft, China remained isolated. Without China, the entire strategic rationale for fighting in this theater weakened. And the fuel trains did not arrive on time. They arrived when they could. Some days, a field received enough gasoline to fly at full capacity. Other days, sorties were cut, then cut again. Pilots waited. Mechanics waited. Schedules dissolved into daily recalculations. Commanders learned to plan not for what they needed, but for what the railway might deliver. That shift, from requirement to expectation, was the first visible symptom of collapse. The second symptom appeared at the front. Road-building units working on the overland route toward Burma were designed to operate like machines. Bulldozers advancing, bridges rising, cuts blasted through hillsides. Instead, they became hostages to fuel scarcity. A single delayed train meant heavy equipment sat idle for days. Explosives were rationed, steel girders piled up in depots hundreds of miles away while crews waited with hand tools. In jungle terrain, time mattered. Rain erased progress. Every week lost meant sections of road reclaimed by vegetation, embankments weakened, cuts softened into mud. Delays were not neutral. They were losses. Then there were the troops themselves. American-trained Chinese divisions in India required steady supplies to remain combat-ready. Ammunition, rations, medical equipment. None of it glamorous, all of it essential. As deliveries lagged, rationing crept in quietly. Ammunition allocations shrank. Training schedules adjusted. Readiness slipped, not because of enemy action, but because logistics could not keep up. This was the most demoralizing kind of failure. There was no single disaster to point to, no moment to rally against, just an accumulation of shortages, each one small enough to excuse, large enough to hurt. The railway, stretched beyond its limits, began to behave like a system under chronic stress. Locomotives broke down more often. Preventive maintenance gave way to emergency repair. Engines ran until they failed, then failed at the worst possible moments. blocking main lines, stranding trains, freezing entire sections of track. A derailment didn't just damage cars. It locked traffic in both directions because there was nowhere else to go. Single-track railways have no forgiveness. When one train stops, everything behind it stops too. During the monsoon, these failures multiplied. Floods didn't need to be catastrophic to be devastating. A washout of a few dozen yards could halt traffic for days. Crews worked around the clock to rebuild roadbed under rain that never seemed to end. When they succeeded, another failure often waited down the line. Yards clogged, sidings filled. Freight that had traveled hundreds of miles stalled short of its destination, waiting for space, waiting for locomotives, waiting for the river crossing. At the Brahmaputra ferry, the problem became impossible to ignore. The ferry was operating at maximum capacity, not theoretical maximum, but physical maximum. Crews worked in shifts that blurred together. Barges moved continuously. Yet the crossing could not pass more cars than its design allowed. No surge of manpower could change that. No speech could intimidate a river. Every delay upstream amplified the congestion at the crossing. Trains arrived late, missed their window, backed up. When water levels shifted, transit times doubled. When weather worsened, the crossing slowed further. It was not a bottleneck anymore. It was a choke. And chokes do not fail gracefully. They fail suddenly when pressure exceeds tolerance. Reports from the field began to converge on the same conclusion. The railway was operating at the edge of failure. Not metaphorically, mathematically. Every increase in demand widened the gap between what was required and what could be delivered. By late 1943, that gap was no longer theoretical. It was visible in grounded aircraft, idle machinery, and stalled offensives. The strategic consequences became unavoidable. The China-Burma-India theater was supposed to be a pressure point against Japan, forcing resources away from the Pacific and tying down enemy forces. Instead, it risked becoming a sink, absorbing men and material without generating decisive results. Planners in Washington and commanders in the field faced an uncomfortable truth. Without a functioning logistics backbone, the theater would remain strategically marginal. No amount of bravery at the front could compensate for a supply line that could not sustain momentum. Japan understood this logic well. Their original assessment had never required them to destroy the railway. They only needed it to remain what it was. Geography, climate, and colonial infrastructure would do the rest. The mountains would stand. The monsoons would fall. The river would widen and narrow on its own schedule. Time was on their side, if the system stayed static. And for a while, it did. British and Indian railway crews performed minor miracles under impossible conditions. They extended operating hours, cannibalized equipment, deferred maintenance to keep more engines running, converted passenger stock to freight. Through sheer effort, they pushed daily tonnage far beyond peacetime levels. But effort has diminishing returns. Each gain came at the cost of reliability. Each additional ton moved increased the likelihood of breakdown elsewhere. The system became brittle, strong under normal load, fragile under shock. The shock came in pieces. A derailment blocked traffic for days. A flood erased track sections that took weeks to rebuild. A shortage of spare parts sidelined locomotives that had no replacements. Each incident alone was manageable. Together, they formed a pattern. The pattern said the same thing over and over. This system cannot scale any further. And scaling was exactly what the war demanded. By the winter of 1943, the situation had reached a tipping point. The railway could still function, but only barely. It could still deliver, but not enough. It could still recover from setbacks, but only if nothing else went wrong. In war, something always goes wrong. This was the moment when logistics stopped being a background concern and became the central strategic problem of the theater. Every plan, every operation, every promise depended on a railway that had no margin left. Commanders began to speak in conditional language. If the fuel arrives, if the track holds, if the ferry keeps running. Planning sessions became exercises in contingency rather than execution. That erosion of certainty was the most dangerous failure of all. Armies can endure hardship. They can endure losses. What they cannot endure is sustained uncertainty about supply. Uncertainty paralyzes initiative. It turns offensives into hesitations and opportunities into risks too great to take. The railway was no longer just a logistical concern. It was a psychological one. Everyone involved could see where the road led if nothing changed. The airlift would plateau. Road construction would stall. Chinese forces would remain constrained. British offensives would be delayed or scaled back. The theater would limp along, consuming resources without delivering results. Japan would not need to defeat it. The system would defeat itself. That realization marked the end of improvisation, the end of hoping that one more workaround, one more patch, one more long shift could carry the day. The math no longer worked. Something fundamental had to change, not a component, not a procedure, not a timetable, the system itself. In the next act, the story turns from collapse to decision, from endurance to intervention, because the war reached a point where it was no longer asking whether the railway could be fixed. It was asking whether the Allies were willing to take control of it completely and force an impossible system to behave as if it were industrial. By early 1944, the problem was no longer misunderstood. It was simply unanswered. Every inspection, every report, every field message pointed to the same conclusion. The Bengal-Assam Railway was not failing because it was neglected or misused or incompetently run. It was failing because it was being asked to do something it had never been designed to do, and because no amount of improvisation could change that fact. The question facing Allied leadership was not whether the system was broken. It was whether anyone was willing to take responsibility for breaking with the way it had always been run. Until then, the railway had been treated like a shared burden. British administrators, Indian crews, local managers, and military users all pooled at different parts of the system, each trying to extract a little more capacity without owning the whole. It was understandable. Wartime cooperation often works that way. Incremental, cautious, respectful of existing structures. But incremental change could not save a system that had reached its physical and organizational limits. What was needed was not another workaround. It was control. That realization carried weight. Taking over a foreign railway in a colonial territory in the middle of an active war was not a technical decision. It was political. It risked friction with allies. It risked resentment. It risked failure on a public scale. But the alternative was worse. If the railway remained as it was, the China-Burma-India theater would remain strategically constrained. No new offensive could be planned with confidence. No buildup could be sustained. No promise could be made without an asterisk attached. The war did not have time for asterisks. So the decision was made, not quietly, not easily, but decisively. The United States would take operational control of the railway. This was not framed as assistance or advisory support. It was framed as a transfer of responsibility. The railway would be operated as a military system, not a colonial one. Its priorities would be defined by war, not commerce. Its performance would be measured in tonnage delivered, not trains run. And the men chosen to execute this change were not generals or engineers in the abstract sense. They were railroaders. The U.S. Army had something few nations possessed at that moment, a deep reserve of civilian industrial expertise, already organized into military units. Across the United States, railroads were among the most complex systems in existence, moving immense volumes of freight with precision, discipline, and redundancy. The men who ran them understood bottlenecks instinctively. They understood that railways fail not because of one dramatic error, but because of small inefficiencies that compound until nothing moves. The Army did not ask these men to learn railways. It asked them to run one. Railway operating battalions were assembled not from theory, but from practice. Crews came from lines that had fed American industry for decades, places where delays cost money, reputations, and sometimes lives. Dispatchers, mechanics, yard masters, train crews, each brought habits shaped by systems that did not tolerate excuses. When these battalions boarded ships bound for India, they were not carrying blueprints for rebuilding the railway. They were carrying a doctrine. That doctrine was simple and radical in its implications. Do not adapt your expectations to a weak system. Adapt the system to your expectations. When the first units arrived and dispersed along the line, the contrast was immediate. Where the railway had previously been managed locally, it was now divided into operational territories. Each battalion assumed responsibility for a defined section: track, rolling stock, crews, and schedules. Accountability, which had previously been diffused, became concentrated. If a train did not run, someone owned the failure. Command and coordination shifted upward. Dispatching was no longer a loose negotiation between stations. It became a centralized function. Schedules were no longer aspirational. They were enforced. Trains moved because the system demanded it, not because conditions happened to align. This was the first shock to the old order. The second was maintenance. Under the old regime, maintenance had been reactive. Locomotives were kept running until they broke, then fixed just enough to return to service. It was a rational response to scarcity, but it guaranteed a cycle of breakdowns that became increasingly disruptive. The American approach reversed that logic. Preventive maintenance was not a luxury. It was a prerequisite. Engines were inspected on fixed intervals. Parts were replaced before failure, not after. Workshops were reorganized to support continuous repair rather than emergency triage. To crews accustomed to improvisation, this seemed wasteful at first. Why take an engine out of service when it still ran? Because a broken engine blocks more than itself. Gradually, the effects became visible. Fewer locomotives failed in service. Fewer trains stalled on main lines. Fewer delays cascaded down the line. But even perfect management could not solve the most obvious limitation. There were not enough locomotives. No schedule, however efficient, could move tonnage that did not exist. No discipline could pull freight cars that were too small, too few, or too worn out to meet demand. This was the point where many systems fail. Management improves, performance rises briefly, and then hits the same wall from a different angle. The American response was not to accept the wall. It was to overwhelm it. The War Department did not attempt to redesign the railway. It did not propose widening the gauge or rebuilding bridges across the Brahmaputra. Those were long-term solutions, incompatible with wartime urgency. Instead, it applied industrial scale to the constraints that could not be removed. If the gauge limited car size, build better cars within that gauge. If the track limited axle loads, design locomotives optimized for those limits. If the system lacked power, manufacture power by the hundreds. American-built meter-gauge locomotives began arriving in India. They were not relics or improvisations. They were purpose-built machines designed to extract maximum performance from narrow track. Alongside them came modern freight cars, longer, heavier, capable of carrying nearly twice the load of the cars they replaced. This was not incremental improvement, it was multiplication. As new equipment entered service, the character of the railway began to change. Trains grew heavier, fewer cars moved more freight, yard operations simplified, throughput increased without requiring miracles from crews. The system, once fragile, began to stiffen. Yet the most profound change was not mechanical, it was cultural. American railway doctrine treated logistics as a combat function. Delays were enemies. Bottlenecks were targets. Efficiency was not a preference, it was a weapon. This mindset spread through the system, not by force, but by results. Indian and British crews who had spent years wrestling with the line saw trains moving with a regularity they had never experienced. They saw breakdowns decline. They saw schedules hold even under adverse conditions. Skepticism gave way to cooperation. The railway, for the first time, began to behave like a system rather than a collection of heroic efforts. This transition did not happen overnight. It happened section by section, yard by yard, locomotive by locomotive. But its direction was unmistakable. Where commanders had once asked, "Can the railway support this operation?" they began to ask, "How much can it support?" That change in language mattered. It marked the moment when logistics ceased to be the limiting factor in planning and became a variable that could be shaped. The decision to take control of the railway did not eliminate geography. The monsoons still fell, the river still flowed. The gauge remained narrow. The terrain did not forgive mistakes. But for the first time, the system confronting those constraints was industrial rather than improvised. And that difference between enduring limits and attacking them with organization, resources, and discipline set the stage for what followed. In the next act, the consequences of that decision become visible, not as promises or projections, but as numbers, as tonnage, as trains that kept running when the map said they should not. The change did not announce itself with speeches or ceremonies. It arrived quietly, in timetables that held and trains that no longer stalled where they used to. At first, the improvement was almost invisible. The same tracks, the same curves, the same river crossing that still demanded patience and precision. To an observer standing beside the line, nothing looked radically different. But the numbers began to shift, and in logistics, numbers are truth. Under American operation, trains started running when they were scheduled to run, not when circumstances allowed. Dispatchers no longer waited for locomotives to appear. Locomotives were assigned, staged, and rotated with intent. The railway stopped reacting and started anticipating. That alone produced gains. Bottlenecks that had once seemed permanent began to loosen. Yards cleared faster. Trains passed more efficiently on single-track sections. Delays that once cascaded for days were contained in hours. Each small efficiency freed capacity elsewhere, and those freed margins compounded. But management was only the first layer of pressure applied to the system. The real transformation arrived by sea. From American ports, ships crossed the Pacific and Indian Oceans, carrying something the railway had never possessed in sufficient quantity: power designed specifically for its limitations. Meter gauge locomotives, built not as compromises but as purpose-built tools, rolled off docks and into service. These engines were narrower than standard American freight locomotives, lighter in construction, and adapted for the tighter curves and lighter rails of the line. Yet they retained the essential strength of modern design. They could pull loads that older engines struggled to move. They could do it more reliably, with fewer failures and longer service intervals. One new locomotive did not change the system. 200 did. As these engines replaced the weakest links in the fleet, the character of the railway changed. Where older locomotives had labored at the edge of adhesion, the new ones worked with margin. Where breakdowns had once been expected, they became exceptions. Alongside the locomotives came the second multiplier, rolling stock. The traditional four-wheel freight cars, with their limited capacity, had forced the railway to move volume through quantity. More cars meant more coupling, more braking, more time in yards, more points of failure. The American-designed cars that arrived were longer, heavier, and more efficient. Their bogie design allowed them to carry nearly twice the load while remaining stable on narrow-gauge track. This was not merely an increase in capacity per car, it was a reduction in complexity. Fewer cars meant shorter trains for the same tonnage, or heavier trains without additional length. Both outcomes mattered. Yard congestion fell. Turnaround times shortened. The ferry crossing across the Brahmaputra, still constrained by physical limits, now moved more tonnage per crossing without increasing the number of cars handled. The river had not changed. The math had. By early 1944, the effects became measurable. Monthly tonnage climbed sharply, not in gradual increments, but in leaps that surprised even those running the system. In the first full month under unified military operation, the railway moved nearly half again as much freight as it had the month before. That kind of increase does not happen by accident. It signaled a shift from marginal survival to systemic dominance. Daily throughput rose past levels once considered theoretical. Trains moved heavier loads more consistently. Breakdowns declined even as usage increased, a sign that preventive maintenance and modern equipment were reinforcing each other rather than competing. And then the railway did something that Japanese planners had never believed possible. It began to outperform the airlift. For years, flying over the Himalayas had been treated as the ultimate logistical solution. Dangerous, costly, but indispensable. Aircraft had braved turbulence that tore wings from airframes, icing that added tons of weight in minutes, and navigation errors that sent crews into mountains or storms. The price had been paid in lives and wreckage. Now the balance shifted. As fuel deliveries stabilized and then surged, the airlift expanded dramatically. But the foundation of that expansion was not aviation, it was rail. The railway delivered fuel to the airfields in quantities that made sustained, predictable flight schedules possible. By mid-1944, the tonnage moved by rail eclipsed what the airlift could carry on its own. The supposed workaround had become secondary to the system it depended on. This reversal had cascading effects across the theater. At the forward depots, stockpiles stopped shrinking and began to grow. Fuel reserves stabilized. Ammunition was no longer rationed to symbolic minimums. Construction materials arrived in sequence rather than sporadically. The difference was not subtle. It was operational. Road-building units working toward Burma no longer planned around scarcity. Bulldozers ran when needed. Explosives were available for continuous blasting rather than hoarded for critical moments. Bridges rose on schedule instead of waiting for steel trapped hundreds of miles away. The pace of construction accelerated, not because terrain became easier, but because logistics ceased to be the brake. The railway did not eliminate monsoons, but it made them survivable. When washouts occurred, repair crews had the materials and equipment they needed on hand. When locomotives required overhaul, workshops had parts in inventory rather than on order. The system absorbed shocks that would previously have paralyzed it. This resilience was the true measure of transformation. Any system can perform well on good days. Only a mature system performs acceptably on bad ones. The American Railway Doctrine, built on redundancy and standardization, created buffers where none had existed. Spare locomotives rotated through service. Maintenance schedules anticipated failure modes rather than reacting to them. Dispatching accounted for disruptions before they cascaded. In practical terms, this meant fewer surprises, and in war, fewer surprises meant initiative. Commanders began planning operations based on what they required, not what they hoped might arrive. This shift from conditional to declarative planning was subtle but decisive. It restored confidence at every level of command. Confidence translated into action. Air operations expanded as fuel deliveries climbed. Aircraft that had once sat idle now flew regular sorties. The volume of supplies delivered over the mountains increased month after month, eventually reaching levels that had once been dismissed as fantasy. The railway, once considered incapable of sustaining modern warfare, became the silent engine behind the largest airlift in military history to that point. And it did so without drama. There were no grand announcements when daily throughput crossed new thresholds, no headlines when monthly totals surged. The proof lay in the absence of crises, in the disappearance of emergency meetings about shortages, in the quiet efficiency of trains arriving on schedule. Japan's original calculation had assumed a static enemy. They had looked at geography and infrastructure and drawn a straight line to inevitability. They had not imagined that the system itself could be altered so radically without rebuilding it from the ground up. They had not accounted for a doctrine that treated capacity as something to be manufactured, not negotiated. By the time the numbers told the full story, the conclusion was unavoidable. What had once been a fragile, overstressed railway had become a logistical backbone strong enough to support simultaneous operations across an entire theater. The impossible had not been solved. It had been overwhelmed. In the next act, the consequences of that overwhelming force come into focus, not in diagrams or dispatch logs, but on battlefields, roads, and airfields that suddenly moved forward instead of waiting. Because once logistics stopped holding the war back, the war began to move. The transformation of the railway did not win a battle on its own. It did something more important. It made battles possible. Once the supply line stabilized, the map of the China-Burma-India theater began to change. Not in theory, but in motion. Plans that had existed only as arrows on paper suddenly acquired weight. Fuel moved forward. Ammunition followed. Steel, timber, and machinery arrived in sequence rather than in fragments. For the first time since the fall of Burma, Allied strategy in the region could advance without pausing to ask whether it would starve itself in the process. The most immediate beneficiary was the road pushing north through jungle and mountain toward China. For months, construction of this overland route had crawled forward under constant constraint. Crews had been forced to work around scarcity, bulldozers idle for lack of diesel, bridge sites stalled while waiting for girders, blasting delayed because explosives were rationed. Progress was measured in frustration as much as distance. Once the railway began delivering reliably, that changed. Fuel trucks arrived when scheduled. Construction materials reached forward depots before crews ran out. Explosives were no longer treated as precious artifacts to be saved for emergencies, but as tools to be used continuously. The tempo of work doubled, then doubled again, even under monsoon conditions that had previously erased gains. Bridges rose across ravines and rivers that had once halted advance entirely. Hundreds of spans, some small, others stretching across gorges hundreds of feet wide, were built not because the terrain became forgiving, but because logistics became dependable. The road did not conquer the jungle. The railway made it irrelevant. As the road neared completion, another transformation unfolded in the air. The Himalayan airlift had always been limited by fuel. Aircraft capacity mattered little if gasoline could not reach the runways. Engines, spare parts, and munitions followed the same logic. Every sortie began on the ground, and the ground was now supplied by rail. As aviation fuel deliveries surged, the airlift expanded beyond previous limits. Flight schedules stabilized, maintenance cycles normalized. Aircraft that had once flown when possible now flew when planned. The scale shifted dramatically. What had once been an operation defined by losses and improvisation became one defined by volume and rhythm. Monthly deliveries to China multiplied. The mountains did not become safer, but they became manageable because logistics removed uncertainty from the equation. Pilots no longer waited for fuel trucks. They waited for weather. That distinction mattered. On the ground, the effect was just as profound. Chinese divisions trained and equipped by the United States began receiving supplies at rates that allowed sustained operations rather than symbolic resistance. Ammunition stocks increased. Medical support improved. Mobility expanded. For the first time since the isolation of China, Allied forces could think beyond survival. They could think about offense. In northern Burma, American-trained units advanced through terrain that had swallowed previous attempts. Their progress depended not on speed alone, but on continuity, on the ability to receive supplies day after day, regardless of weather or distance. The railway provided that continuity. Captured airfields were expanded quickly because heavy equipment arrived without delay. New bases came online faster than Japanese planners anticipated. Each gain reinforced the next, creating momentum where stagnation had once ruled. The British 14th Army, preparing for its own campaign to retake Burma, experienced the same shift. Supplying a force of that scale required precision bordering on obsession. A single infantry division consumed hundreds of tons daily. Multiply that by corps and armies, and the demand became staggering. The railway did not deliver supplies to every forward position directly. Roads and aircraft completed the final legs. But the railway delivered what mattered most: mass, predictability, and timing. Commanders no longer asked whether supplies might arrive. They assumed they would. That change transformed planning. Operations were designed around requirements rather than contingencies. Timetables became commitments. Reserves became real. When offensives began, they did so with a logistical depth that had been absent before. Advances could be sustained rather than paused. Setbacks could be absorbed without collapse. The theater moved from fragile to resilient. Japan felt this shift indirectly but unmistakably. Every Allied advance increased pressure on Japanese supply lines already strained by distance and interdiction. While Allied logistics grew stronger, Japanese logistics grew weaker. The balance did not turn on a single battle or breakthrough. It turned on endurance. The railway, once dismissed as irrelevant, became a force multiplier across the theater. It fed the road that reopened China. It powered the airlift that sustained Chinese resistance. It supported armies that pushed Japanese forces back through terrain they had once dominated. None of this would have been possible without the prior transformation of the supply system. Tactics, courage, and leadership mattered, but only because logistics allowed them to matter. This was the quiet victory hidden beneath the visible ones. No parades marked the arrival of freight cars. No medals were awarded for on-time deliveries. Yet every convoy that reached China, every sortie that crossed the Himalayas, every unit that advanced through Burma carried the imprint of the railway's revival. The irony was complete. Japan had correctly identified geography as a weapon. Mountains, rivers, climate, and infrastructure all favored defense. What they failed to anticipate was that geography could be neutralized not by clever maneuver, but by relentless supply. The railway did not change the terrain. It changed what the terrain meant. By late 1944, the China-Burma-India theater was no longer a strategic liability. It had become a contributor, a pressure point that forced Japan to fight on unfavorable terms, stretching resources and complicating defense. That outcome rested not on a single decision, but on thousands of small, disciplined actions repeated day after day. Trains running on time, fuel arriving as expected, depots stocked before they emptied. Victory did not roar into existence. It rolled in on steel wheels. In the final act, the story turns away from operations and outcomes and toward the people who made this transformation possible, and the lesson they left behind about how modern wars are truly won. The railway did not end the war. It did not capture cities or raise flags. What it did was quieter, and in many ways, harder. It kept running. While offensives advanced and airlifts expanded, thousands of men worked far from the front in conditions that bore little resemblance to the railroads they had known back home. Dispatch offices were improvised out of wooden sheds, maintenance yards became swamps during monsoon season, paper records dissolved under constant humidity, equipment corroded faster than experience had taught them was possible. Heat was relentless. In summer, temperatures climbed past levels most of the men had ever worked in. Humidity turned every task into exhaustion. A job that took 8 hours in the Midwest took 16 here. Locomotives demanded constant attention. Bearings seized, gaskets failed, boilers leaked. Every moving part needed care, or the system punished neglect immediately. Disease became an enemy as real as any opposing force. Malaria spread through camps and yards. Dengue fever, dysentery, and other illnesses thinned crews even as demands increased. Men worked through fevers, returned from infirmaries early, or were quietly replaced by others who took their place without ceremony. Japanese air attacks did not disappear entirely. Rail yards were bombed, locomotives were damaged, freight cars burned. The difference now was not invulnerability, but recovery. Damaged engines returned to service in days, not weeks. Replacement parts were fabricated locally when shipments could not arrive in time. The system bent, but it did not break. This resilience defined the railway's true achievement. It was not that the line never failed. It was that failure no longer stopped it. The men who ran the trains understood this intuitively. They did not speak in grand terms about strategy or victory. In letters home, they wrote about tonnage moved, engines repaired, and trains cleared through yards before sunrise. They measured success in continuity. Another day without paralysis. Another schedule met despite weather. Another shipment that reached the front on time. They knew who depended on those shipments. Ammunition delivered today would be fired weeks later in Burma. Fuel unloaded tonight would lift aircraft over the Himalayas next month. Food, medicine, and spare parts moved invisibly forward, connecting their labor to outcomes they would never see firsthand. They were not heroes in the traditional sense. They were specialists, doing their jobs under conditions that tested the limits of endurance. When the war ended, there were no victory photographs of the railway. Attention shifted to battles, generals, and dramatic turning points. The railway faded back into the background. its wartime transformation gradually absorbed into peacetime routine. Locomotives and freight cars remained in service for years, even decades, serving a region that would soon be reshaped by independence and partition. The system they had built out of urgency endured longer than the war that created it. The lesson of the railway was not subtle, but it was easy to overlook. Japan's strategists had been rational. They had looked at geography, climate, and infrastructure and concluded that sustained Allied operations were impossible. Their mistake was not underestimating terrain. It was underestimating adaptability. They assumed systems remain static, that railways remain what they were built to be, that colonial infrastructure could not be transformed quickly enough to matter. They assumed that limits, once identified, became permanent. The United States proved otherwise, not through elegance or ingenuity alone, but through scale, discipline, and refusal to accept inevitability. The gauge never changed. The monsoons never stopped. The river was never bridged. Yet the outcome shifted decisively. Because modern war does not reward those who identify constraints. It rewards those who learn how to operate ruthlessly inside them. The Bengal and Assam Railway became a case study in that truth. A system designed for tea became a backbone for armies. A fragile line became resilient. An impossible supply route became decisive advantage. Not because it was rebuilt, but because it was overwhelmed. In the end, the men who ran the railway summarized it best, without ceremony or drama. They did not claim to have won battles. They claimed only to have kept trains moving. And in a war where everything depended on movement, that was enough. Wars aren't only decided by battles. They're decided by systems that keep moving when everything else fails. If you want more stories like this, subscribe for future episodes exploring the hidden mechanics of World War II.